De Quo 1201. Close your eyes for a moment and let your mind drift backward, past cities built of glass and steel, past the humming glow of modern life, past centuries of noise and invention, until you find yourself in a world cloaked in shadow. The year is 1348. The air is thick and still. The bells toll more often than they ever should. In the streets of Europe, something is spreading. Something fast, something cruel. And in this darkness walks a figure unlike any you've seen before, hooded, robed, gloved, and masked. His face is hidden behind the long, curved beak of a bird, and in his hand he carries a staff, not for walking, but for distance. This is the Plague Doctor. And his job, for all its mystery, was not to heal, but to witness. You might picture him as a harbinger of death, and you wouldn't be wrong, but before the eerie masks, before the strange rituals, before the myths and legends that would follow, he was just a man. Often poorly trained, usually underpaid, and constantly afraid. The Plague Doctor was not some brilliant savior or mystical figure. He was more often a desperate placeholder, someone sent in to keep order when everything else was unraveling. Let's be clear from the start. Being a Plague Doctor was not an honor. It was not even really a job most people wanted. It was a last resort. In many cases, towns or city councils would force someone to take the role. If you were a surgeon with modest skills, a young physician hoping to earn a name, or even just someone who'd fallen into the bad graces of authority, you might find yourself summoned and sent into the very heart of disease. The tools were as grim as the task. The mask, the famous beaked mask, was stuffed with herbs, spices, and occasionally vinegar-soaked sponges. People believed that bad smells, or miasma, were what carried the plague, so the stronger the scent, the safer the doctor, at least in theory. The gloves, the robe, the waxed overcoat, all meant to prevent contact with the infected, but these early attempts at hazmat suits were mostly symbolic. The plague didn't care about layers of linen and leather. It slipped through the seams, it clung to the air, it hid in the folds of a patient's breath. And what exactly did these doctors do? Not much in terms of curing. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no real understanding of germs. Some treatments included bloodletting, placing frogs or onions on buboes, or applying poultices made from herbs and animal fat. Others prescribed crushed emeralds, bathing in vinegar, or the burning of aromatic woods. None of it worked. At best, it provided comfort. At worst, it accelerated death. But still, plague doctors kept records. They counted the bodies, they tracked symptoms, they sometimes even performed rudimentary autopsies, when allowed. Their presence was as much political as medical, a visible symbol that anyone was trying to help, that the town had not entirely given up. And what did they see, day after day? Streets lined with carts of the dead, homes boarded shut with entire families inside, children crying over parents who would never wake, entire neighborhoods hollowed out by the disease, silent but for the buzzing of flies. To walk among this devastation wasn't just a test of physical endurance. It was a slow, gnawing erosion of the soul. Many doctors went mad. Some turned to alcohol, others to prayer, others to cold indifference. They were rarely thanked, more often feared. If they arrived in your town, it meant the worst had already come. And when they left, if they left, it meant only that there were no more patients to see. So why did anyone do it? Some hoped for wealth. Plague doctors were sometimes offered generous pay, though rarely delivered. Others believed they were serving a higher purpose. Some were simply trapped. Like everyone else, they were swept up in something they could not stop, trying to make sense of a world that had gone quiet with grief. Tonight we walk with them, not to glorify, but to understand, not to fear, but to remember. For the story of the Plague Doctor is not one of heroism nor of evil. It is the story of what it means to keep moving forward, step by step, when everything around you is falling apart. Sur 7.1. After the Black Death swept through Europe like a shadow with no end, the Plague Doctor refused to vanish with the bodies he tended. He lingered, not in the flesh, but in form. For centuries, long after the actual physicians faded into obscurity, their ghostly silhouette, beaked mask, black cloak, gloved hands, remained etched into Europe's collective memory. But not as heroes, as something stranger. In art, he became an omen, a figure that haunted cathedrals and crypts, creeping across frescoes, tapestries, woodcuts, and manuscripts. His shape appeared again and again, staring from the background as death danced in the foreground. One of the earliest known portrayals comes from the mid-15th century. The triumph of death, painted on the cemetery walls of Pisa. There, amidst skeletal horses trampling the living, a black-robed figure with a long, hooked nose stands silently, bearing witness to the collapse of life. Was he offering help, or merely watching it all end? This image became a motif, the Plague Doctor as reaper, as judge, as the faceless reminder that no status, no coin, no title could shield you. Whether nobleman or nun, merchant or beggar, all would eventually be seen by the man in the beaked mask. Perhaps the most enduring artistic tradition featuring the Plague Doctor was the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death. These murals and engravings spanned centuries, showing skeletons leading people from all walks of life in a grim, grotesque conga line to the grave, Kings, bishops, children, peasants, all linked hand in hand with death, smiling or screaming. And often among them, near the front, was the plague doctor, not entirely dead, not quite alive. A strange middle thing, his mask with its hollow eyes and impossible beak, was itself a paradox. It was meant to protect, to filter the air, but it became an icon of dread, a symbol that a town had been breached. That contagion had entered not just the lungs, but the soul of the place. Artists seized on this symbolism. The doctor began to appear in the margins of illuminated books, peeking out between vines and angels. He was carved into stone at church entrances, painted into the corners of altarpieces, not always central, but always there, always watching. Literature, too, embraced him. In Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the very midst of the plague, the spectre of the plague doctor looms even if unnamed. The 10 young Florentines who flee to a countryside villa to tell each other stories are escaping him as much as the disease. The doctor is the unseen force chasing them, proof that even imagination must acknowledge reality's darkness. As centuries passed, the image grew more theatrical. In Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, the plague doctor strays into London streets as a spectral figure of dread and duty, his appearance both reassuring and horrifying. He brings no cure, only structure, a face to blame, a name to curse. Then came the Romantics, the Gothics. Writers like Edgar Allan Poe took the doctor and twisted him further, reshaping him into a full-blown nightmare. In The Mask of the Red Death, a blood-smeared masked figure interrupts a decadent masquerade, bringing with him not just infection, but inevitability. Poe never names the plague doctor, but the symbolism is clear. He doesn't need to. The mask speaks for itself, and so the plague doctor, once a hired hand, a reluctant bureaucrat, became something archetypal, a canvas onto which society painted its deepest fears, the fear of illness, of isolation, of helplessness. In art, he is both absurd and terrifying. In stories, he is foolish and prophetic, a man who knows nothing, yet holds the power to declare death. It's a curious evolution, from fumbling physicians with leather pouches of herbs to characters in Gothic tales and horror shows. He became myth, and with that transformation came endurance. Even in places where plague never reached, his image spread. Across Europe, across centuries. Why did he endure? Because the beaked doctor represents the in-between. Between life and death, between science and superstition, between healer and executioner. He is not simply a man, he is a mirror. So tonight, as you rest, picture him again, not as a threat, but as a memory. Imagine his shadow flickering across ancient walls, his masked face peering out from a woodcut, ink-stained and still. Imagine him not coming for you, but waiting, to be remembered. Long after the plague had retreated from Europe's doorsteps, the ghost of the plague doctor remained, not in flesh and blood, but in paint, ink, and nightmare. The black-robed figure with his grotesque beak and hollow gaze was too powerful a symbol to forget. Over time, he evolved, from obscure medical professional to haunting metaphor, from reluctant witness to icon of dread. Artists of the late medieval and Renaissance periods returned to him again and again, not to celebrate, but to warn. He wandered through the dance of death frescoes, guiding kings and beggars alike in their final shuffle. He peered out from cathedral walls and lurked in the margins of manuscripts. Sometimes he was painted with a grin, sometimes with accusing fingers, always in motion, always leading someone to their end. In one such mural, dated to the mid-15th century and found in the Camposanto Monumentale of Pisa, the plague doctor looms amidst the carnage, pointing toward a group of elegant young nobles. Death, it seems, makes no exceptions. Rich or poor, pious or sinful, none escape the long shadow of his staff. Elsewhere, in woodcuts and engravings, he joins skeletal processions or stands sentinel beside dying patients, his beak not filtering disease, but amplifying dread. The beak itself becomes a contradiction, part shield, part spear. It was meant to protect the wearer. Instead, it became the mark of suffering's arrival. Literature, too, kept him alive. In Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, we glimpse his outlines in the fearful background as 10 Florentines flee the plague to share tales. Though not always named, he lingers in their stories, a silent symbol of the world they've abandoned. In one story, a greedy doctor refuses to treat a dying man unless paid first, only to be outwitted by the clever patient who tricks him and dies with a smile. Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year gives us a more somber version. His fictional physician, Dr. Heath, moves through London with solemn calm. He treats the sick, he buries the dead. He offers advice that no one wants to hear. He is not a hero, he is not a villain, he is simply there, watching, enduring. And then came the Romantics, the Gothics, the horror writers. Poe, in particular, seized on the plague doctor's mythic edge. In The Mask of the Red Death, a stranger cloaked in funeral robes crashes an opulent masquerade. His mask mirrors death itself, beaked and bloodied. The revelers fall silent. One by one, they die. No cure, no escape, only inevitability. Though Poe never calls him a plague doctor, the parallels are clear. The costume, the timing, the doom. This figure, part reaper, part reminder, became the embodiment of what we fear most, the unstoppable, the unseen. Even in modern times, the Plague Doctor persists. He appears in gothic novels and steampunk fiction, in horror films and Halloween masks. Video games cast him as villain or vigilante. In manga and anime, he's reborn as a mystical healer or a cursed wanderer. He no longer treats the sick. He haunts our imaginations, but beneath the layers of drama and embellishment lies something real, something raw. These men, these original Plague Doctors, were not monsters. They were not myths. They were often poorly equipped, sometimes foolish, sometimes brave. They walked into danger with no promise of safety or reward. Some hoped to help, others hoped to profit. Many simply obeyed orders, but they all stood before a force too large to understand, wearing masks that could not hide their fear. So why does he remain? Why does the Plague Doctor still appear in our stories, our art, our dreams? Because he represents us, our doubt, our desperation, our attempts to find meaning in chaos. He is not just a figure of the past, he is a mirror, reflecting every moment in which humanity has reached for certainty and found only silence. And so tonight, as we rest beneath blankets of quiet, let his image pass gently through your thoughts. Let the beaked mask be not a threat, but a question. Let the dark cloak be not a warning, but a whisper. And let the Plague Doctor remind us not just of death, but of the strange, persistent beauty of trying to face it. 0702 Inofar. As the centuries rolled on, the image of the Plague Doctor, once rooted in reality, began to shift more deeply into the realm of myth. No longer simply a man in a beaked mask, he became an archetype, a symbol that artists, writers, and thinkers used to explore the nature of death, disease, and the human struggle for control in a chaotic world. One of the most vivid reflections of this transformation can be seen in the 1562 painting, The Triumph of Death, by Peter Bruegel the Elder. In it, skeletal armies swarm over a devastated landscape, cutting down the rich and poor alike. Ships burn, villages crumble, and in the midst of this carnage walks a solitary Plague Doctor, gaunt, masked, and calm amid the chaos. He does not flee. He does not save. He simply moves forward, one step at a time, a quiet spectre among shrieking souls. This painting, and others like it, turned the Plague Doctor into something more than a medical figure. He was now an allegory, the walking embodiment of inevitability, a personification of that most terrifying of truths, that death comes for us all, regardless of station, virtue, or preparation. The Dance Macabre, or Dance of Death, continued this theme. These murals and prints, widespread from the 14th to 17th centuries, often included Plague Doctors in their grim processions. Dressed in black, clutching an hourglass or staff, they led bishops, peasants, merchants, and maidens toward the grave. There was no escaping their call, no denying their message. In literature, too, the figure expanded. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the shadow of the Black Death, introduced readers to physicians who were inept, greedy, or simply overwhelmed. Some were tricked by clever patients, others fleeced the dying. But behind the humor was something bitter, a recognition that in the face of plague, even doctors were powerless. In Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, the fictional Dr. Heath emerges as a grim and dutiful man. He treats the sick without hope, buries the dead with weary hands, and observes suffering without expectation of reward. He is not a savior, he is a witness, and that perhaps is the truest role the Plague Doctor ever filled. And then there was Edgar Allan Poe. With the Mask of the Red Death, Poe created a nightmare. A cloaked figure arrives at a masquerade ball held by Prince Prospero and his wealthy guests, people who believed they could wall themselves off from the plague. The intruder wears garments that resemble the grave. His mask mimics the face of a corpse, and as he walks through the ballroom, one by one, the revelers fall. Not because he touches them, but because he exists. Poe never names the figure as a Plague Doctor. He doesn't have to. The symbolism is clear. The beak may be gone, but the message is the same. Death cannot be locked out. Sickness cannot be ignored. And no mask, no matter how elaborate, can shield us from what waits at the door. Through these stories and images, the Plague Doctor became something more than a historical curiosity. He became myth, memory, warning. The line between healer and reaper blurred, between comfort and fear. The very garb meant to protect him from disease now made him indistinguishable from it. And as the centuries passed, his image only grew stronger. In novels, he was reshaped as a tragic romantic, cursed to wander among the dying. In plays, he became a figure of satire, wielding garlic and prayers with foolish confidence. In comics and games, he became a brooding anti-hero or a spectral villain, cloaked in shadows and secrets. But through it all, something constant remained. The Plague Doctor still wore the beaked mask, still walked alone, still carried with him the echo of a world that had once screamed in silence. Tonight we remember him not just as a figure of fear, but as a reflection of ourselves, our helplessness, our hopes, our need to assign form to the formless. In every Plague Doctor costume, in every chilling painting or whispered legend, there lies a question. How do we face the things we cannot understand? Let his silent gaze remind us that behind every mask there is a human face, and behind every story of death there is also a story of someone who stayed. 7211 Silium. Even in death, the plague doctor would not rest. Long after the Black Death's worst had passed, his ghostly form continued to haunt the canvases of painters, the verses of poets, and the imagination of generations. A man who once wandered cobbled streets, with herbs in his mask, and fear in his heart had now become something more. A symbol, both absurd and terrifying, of humanity's fragile grasp on life in the face of uncontrollable ruin. In 17th century Europe, he was carved into wood blocks and etched into copperplate. He emerged in the iconography of apocalyptic art, standing stiff among skeletons and angels, his beaked mask turned downward, as if still sniffing out illness. The dance of death persisted in new forms, and in many depictions the plague doctor had now replaced the skeleton, leading the mournful procession of doomed souls. Not a skeleton, but not quite human. A walking contradiction. Literature, too, carried him forward. By the 18th century, his image, half healer, half omen, was fully embedded in Gothic tradition. Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, published in 1722, painted him with tragic reverence. He was not brave nor noble, but necessary. He didn't promise a cure, only presence. He was a form in the fog, a body moving through abandoned streets, noting the dead and helping when he could, though always one step behind the sickness. Then came the Romantics, who did what Romantics do. They turned him into a poem. A brooding figure alone in a darkening world, a man of science betrayed by superstition, a scapegoat, a mourner. They stripped him of what little medical credibility he had and gave him metaphor instead. And thus the plague doctor became myth. No tale cemented this transformation more than Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death. In this fever dream of a story, a masked figure crashes a masquerade ball held by the wealthy and powerful, who thought they could shut out death. The stranger is silent, his clothes soaked in blood, his face pale and stiff. No one knows who he is, until one by one, they begin to die. Poe never says the words plague doctor, but he didn't need to. The imagery speaks volumes. The mask had become a symbol of inevitability. It no longer mattered who wore it or why. It simply existed, to unsettle, to accuse, to remind. Over time, the plague doctor began to evolve yet again. He appeared in new costumes. In Assassin's Creed, he's a masked enemy lurking in Venetian alleyways. In Japanese manga, he's a supernatural medic with the power to manipulate life and death. In steampunk novels, he rides airships and brews arcane tonics. Always masked, always watching. He became popular, even stylish. His eerie look was perfect for Halloween, for video games, for street art. People wore his image like a second skin, half irony, half unease. He had become part of our collective aesthetic, a visual shorthand for dread. But even as he shifted forms, something at his core remained unshakably human. Beneath the costume, the plague doctor was always just a man, frightened, confused, doing what he could, however clumsy or ineffective, standing between chaos and the unknown, holding a stick and hoping it would be enough. That's the paradox, the very absurdity of the plague doctor. The oversized beak, the waxy robes, the pouches of herbs makes him relatable. We recognize his panic dressed as procedure, his caution disguised as cure. He's us, in our own version of uncertainty. Because haven't we all reached for something, anything, when the world seemed to fall apart? Haven't we all hoped that ritual or repetition, or the right mask, could keep the darkness at bay? So tonight, as you lie still, think of him not as an agent of fear, but of effort, not as a reminder of death, but of the strange courage it takes to show up anyway, to walk into plague-ridden cities, to count the dying, to wear the mask, even when it didn't help, to try, because at the heart of it, the plague doctor wasn't a monster. He was a man in the wrong time, trying to do the right thing. That's why he endures. 106. As time passed and the memory of plague years grew hazy with dust, the figure of the plague doctor began to morph again, this time into something almost mythical. His silhouette, beaked, cloaked, and silent, transcended medicine, art, and history. He was no longer merely a man in protective garb. He had become a symbol of terror, of confusion, of hope. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the plague doctor re-emerged not in hospital records or city streets, but in the realms of fiction, horror, fantasy, and pop culture. The long-beaked mask, once designed to ward off disease, had become a visual shorthand for dread. He appeared in films as a villain, in novels as a mysterious guide, in Halloween costumes and carnivals as a spooky anachronism, and in every appearance he seemed to whisper a message: I have been here before. Artists embraced him anew. Painters used his silhouette to evoke decay and forgotten fears. Street artists spray-painted him on crumbling walls, modern prophets warning of old dangers. In digital media, he became an icon, both ironic and reverent. On internet forums, he was a meme. On stage, a character. In video games, he wielded syringes instead of swords, his robes billowing like a sorcerer's cloak. Perhaps the most curious transformation was how people began to find beauty in him. Fashion designers created Plague Doctor-inspired garments. Musicians wore his mask in music videos. Even during global health crises in modern times, the image of the Plague Doctor resurfaced, not as a medical authority, but as a cultural artifact, a kind of dark comfort. It's a strange evolution for a figure born of desperation. His original purpose, to protect, to treat, was long forgotten. What remained was the emotional weight he carried. He became a mirror for our fears, a blank face we could project our anxieties onto. Why does he endure? Perhaps because his contradictions feel familiar. He is at once savior and spectre, healer and horror. He is a man of science cloaked in mystery, a presence that reassures and unsettles in equal measure. He also reminds us of our limits. No matter how advanced we become, the spectre of death, disease, and helplessness never truly disappears. We may trade masks and gowns for diagnostics and data, but the fear, that ancient, primal fear, remains, and the Plague Doctor is its avatar. In a way, we dress him up not just to scare ourselves, but to contain that fear, to name it, to give it shape. Just like people once wore charms or burned herbs, we make art and stories. We bring the past forward, not just to remember, but to cope. There's also a quiet dignity in his story, because while his methods were crude, his heart, at least for some, was sincere. He stood between the sick and the grave. He did not flee. He endured. Even now, in an age of vaccines and virology, his mask still finds its way into our dreams. We paint him. We write about him. We summon him when the world feels unsteady. So, as this evening draws to a close, let us not mock the Beaked Doctor. Let us not reduce him to mere costume or caricature. Let us remember the real men behind those masks. Some were frauds, some were heroes, most were just people, caught in something far bigger than themselves. They walked into danger with little more than leather, herbs, and hope. They faced panic with imperfect tools and stubborn courage, and in doing so they left behind more than legend. They left behind a lesson. That in the darkest of times, even a flawed, fumbling figure in a bird mask can stand for something enduring, the will to try. So rest easy now. Let the image of the Plague Doctor drift across your imagination. Less a monster, more a monument, a tribute to resilience, to the strange poetry of human effort, and to the shadows we keep company with, even in the brightest light. Norisano 2107, even as the Plague Doctor gradually faded from the streets, his image did not vanish, it evolved. He slipped into our stories, into paintings and poems, not as a historical footnote, but as a haunting metaphor. From Renaissance frescoes to 19th century novels, the beaked mask lingered like a shadow on the walls of memory, a symbol of medicine's desperation and mankind's fragile courage in the face of annihilation. The figure of the Plague Doctor became both warning and witness. In medieval dances of death, he moved in step with kings and paupers alike, indistinguishable from the skeletons he marched beside. In early modern engravings, he loomed through pestilential streets like a silent sentinel. His mask, once meant to protect, became a kind of theatrical exaggeration, an icon of sickness and fate, and literature embraced him too. In Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, he appears as a tired but determined observer, chronicling the horror while powerless to stop it. In Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of the Red Death, he arrives unannounced, a silent guest at a masquerade where death wears many disguises. Though unnamed, the figure is unmistakable. He is the Plague Doctor, a vessel of dread. As centuries passed, his presence only grew more potent. Gothic fiction turned him into a villain. Folklore made him a sorcerer. Modern horror gave him new life in video games, graphic novels, and post-apocalyptic art. Always the same mask, always the same warning. Why does he endure? Perhaps it's because his contradictions mirror our own? He was a man of science, guided by flawed beliefs, a protector whose presence meant you were already lost, a healer whose remedies often harmed. He embodies the double-edged nature of hope in crisis, comforting and cruel, noble and naive. He is not just history's footnote, he is our cultural scar, a lingering reminder of what we fear and how we respond to fear. Even now, in a time of global networks and high-tech medicine, when outbreaks spark instant headlines and vaccines race through development pipelines, the Plague Doctor still feels close, not in what he did, but in what he represents, a person stepping forward when most would turn away. Clad in whatever armor the moment allowed. In that sense, the Plague Doctor isn't just a medieval relic. He's a symbol of something timeless, the impulse to act, to care, to try, even when the odds are grim and the outcomes uncertain. And so, before we turn to the next chapter of his story, let us pause to consider what it meant to wear that mask, to walk into homes thick with sorrow, to be the last living face a person might see. Whether revered or reviled, heroic or helpless, the Plague Doctor mattered, but all symbols fade eventually, and in time, so did he. By the end of the 17th century, the streets of Europe had grown quieter. not just from the waning of plague outbreaks, but from the fading footsteps of the plague doctor himself. The figure that once stood between life and death, draped in black robes and masked like a spectral bird, had begun to vanish, not in a single moment, but gradually, imperceptibly, like mist burned away by the rising sun of modern science. There were many reasons for his decline, but chief among them was the shift in medical thought. As humoral theory crumbled under the pressure of observation and experiment, the old ways lost their grip. Physicians like Paracelsus, Ambroise Paré, and Thomas Sydenham challenged the long-held ideas of balance and bile. They advocated for empirical medicine, for cleaner environments, and for treatments grounded not in superstition, but in study. To them, the plague doctor was not a savior, but a symptom, an emblem of everything outdated in the practice of healing. At the same time, the plague itself began to change. Its grip loosened. Outbreaks became less frequent, less devastating, confined to isolated regions and smaller communities. By the Enlightenment, cities like London, Paris, and Amsterdam had invested in sanitation systems, quarantine protocols, and permanent hospitals. The need for contracted crisis doctors, men hired for a single emergency, began to fade. Public health was no longer the work of individuals in masks and canes. It became institutional, structural, governed by boards and ministers and legislation. The lone plague doctor was replaced by something bigger, colder, more effective, a system. And yet the plague doctor didn't disappear overnight. In parts of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and Russia, where the reach of Enlightenment reforms was slower, plague doctors remained active well into the 18th century. In 1720, during a severe outbreak in Marseille, France, a team of plague doctors was still dispatched, masked, cloaked, and bearing all the symbols of an older age. And in Moscow, during the 1770 epidemic, their presence was still recorded, though often met with skepticism or even hostility. Their treatments were increasingly seen as harmful. Bloodletting, purging, and mercury-based tonics came under fierce criticism. Some argued they weakened patients more than the disease itself. Others accused plague doctors of prolonging outbreaks through improper hygiene or sheer incompetence. One particularly tragic case tells of a Russian plague doctor beaten to death by a mob who believed his rituals had summoned demons. It was a brutal, chaotic end to a profession born of chaos itself. Still, even as their practical role collapsed, their image persisted. Artists continued to sketch them. Engravers carved them into prints. Writers placed them in their novels, not as physicians, but as ominous harbingers. The mask no longer signaled medicine, it signaled myth. In time, their absence became their power. The plague doctor transformed from man to metaphor, from flawed professional to enduring symbol, because what remained was not the efficacy of their care, but the weight of what they had witnessed. They had walked through streets where no one else dared. They had counted the dying and sometimes died themselves. They had worn masks not to hide, but to protect. Their science had failed, yes. Their methods had often done more harm than good. But their presence, their strange, stoic willingness to stand between suffering and abandonment, that lingered. As medicine moved on, it left them behind, but art, memory, and the human heart held on. Because in the story of the plague doctor's decline, we find something profoundly familiar. The fear of irrelevance, the slow eclipse of what once felt vital, the dread of being replaced, misunderstood, forgotten. And so the beaked mask, stripped of purpose, became something else entirely, a reminder of our limits, of how little we know, of how fragile we remain. The decline of the plague doctor was inevitable, but the mark he left on our imagination has proven far harder to erase. Across centuries and continents, from medieval plague towns to modern hospitals, the silhouette of the plague doctor has remained, a grim figure cloaked in mystery, tragedy, and quiet endurance. He may have vanished from the alleys of Florence or the streets of London, but in another way, he never truly left us. We see him now not in the flesh, but in memory, in the images that haunt museum halls, in the digital echoes of historical recreations, in the whispered fascination of dark folklore. He has become a canvas upon which we project our oldest questions. What does it mean to help in the face of helplessness? How do we carry hope into a room full of death? Even in our own times, we reach instinctively for his image. During pandemics, when fear returns to the air like an old smell, we find comfort in that eerie shape. In his strange, beaked mask, we see a reminder that someone, once, walked into danger on purpose. Perhaps that's why the plague doctor continues to fascinate. He was not merely a doctor, he was not even a particularly successful one, but he was present, in the chaos, in the silence, in the thick fog of despair. And presence in times of crisis matters more than we realize. There's something profoundly human about the figure, his awkward mix of science and superstition, his blend of bravery and confusion. He did not flee, he showed up. That, in itself, was an act of resistance. In this way, the plague doctor becomes a kind of mirror, a reminder of how fragile we are, how flawed, and yet how stubbornly we try. We try with masks, with rituals, with herbs and hymns. We try with reason, with desperation, with love. He is not just a historical curiosity. He is a symbol of the many faces we wear when fear descends, the roles we take on, The stories we create to explain the unexplainable. The tools we wield, crude as they may be, to fight back the dark. And as we lie here tonight, letting history drift around us like mist, we can allow his presence to settle into something softer. Not terrifying, not absurd, but poignant. Because behind the beaked mask was a person, one who had nightmares, one who might have been scared, one who likely didn't know what he was doing half the time, but still did it. We often romanticize the past, or mock it, but the plague doctor resists both. He stands in the middle, unheroic, unholy, and entirely human. So let us honor him not for what he achieved, but for what he attempted, for stepping forward when others stepped back, for enduring what many could not, for being the flawed guardian of a collapsing world. And let us recognize that in every generation, there are people who take up that same burden. They may not wear beaked masks, their tools may be sharper, their knowledge deeper, but the spirit, the quiet, trembling courage, remains the same. So as this tale comes to an end, and you drift towards sleep, let the image of the plague doctor fade, not in fear, but in gratitude, a strange, solemn figure who reminds us that in the worst of times, people still cared, and that perhaps is the most enduring medicine of all. Sleep well.